Well, thank you so much, Eric, for joining me today. I'm very excited to really talk about your journey and the phases that you've been in throughout your life and career and your journey up to this point. For those who don't know, I mean, if you don't mind going through it, is wherever you want to start, but kind of going through your journey with social entrepreneurship, tech, food, now investing. I mean, you've kind of played in a bunch of different landscapes. So walk us through the journey before Astanor.
Thank you, Grant, for having me. It has been a long journey. Maybe I'll take a bit of a long shortcut. I've always been a foodie. When I was young, I was exposed to food by some of my family members. Actually, my grandmother had a young nephew. Well, a young nephew. He was much older than I was, obviously. He was almost the age of my grandmother because he was the son of her older sister. The point is, he was a chef. He was also gay, which in the 1950s and 40s and 50s, especially 40s in France, was not the great thing to be. And so he was a bit of an outsider in the family. And but I really enjoyed going to his place on weekends or on the day off, and he would show me all kinds of tricks about doing things, in the kitchen. And I got exposed to a lot of things, including wine, because he would give me wine when I was like 6 or 7, just to try. He said you have to start your palate and everything. And then he passed away, and I kind of put that in the back of my mind, and I kind of left it on the side because I was also a geek, and before geeks were very fashionable. So I was doing math and physics and chemistry, and I ended up going to UC Berkeley, and I ended up going to Stanford, and I ended up starting my career in Silicon Valley in the early 80s, my first job in 1982. And then, the dominant thinking or thought process about food at the time was, food is a waste of time because it takes you away from your computer. So I really repressed any side of, any foodie side. Although when I would fly back to France and see my friends, I would splurge into, going to a few restaurants and everything throughout the 80s and 90s. It's only when I moved back to Europe with Benchmark Capital. I went on to launch Benchmark Capital Europe in 2000, and then I started to go, to restaurants again, and even to meet some chefs that I felt were really interesting people in terms of the thought process. People like Jamie Oliver, people like René Redzepi at Noma, at the very beginning of Noma, people like Guy Savoy in Paris, who were some of the first people. Guy was one of the first guys that really put in light, in the limelight, the farmers, the people that were actually producing the produce, and as opposed to just a chef that was doing magic. No, he was actually taking this fantastic produce coming out of farms and small scale producers and sublimate the thing. And it would be something that I really resonated back with my childhood. And so I became more and more interested by the food world. And in parallel, I had launched with my friend Charlie Kleisner a social entrepreneurship accelerator in India, out of all places. I think that was my midlife crisis. So we spent quite a bit of time in India, and one of the main issues that we had to face as social entrepreneurs or as backers of social entrepreneurs was, in the early 2000s, how to ensure livelihood for farmers and people in the rural areas. And so looking at farming techniques and starting to be aware of the issues around soil erosion or soil exhaustion, more than soil erosion, soil exhaustion because of farming practices. So got exposed to the idea of regenerating the soil. And so all these things came together a few years later as I'd become chairman of the foundation that Jamie Oliver started for food education of children. It's called the Jamie Oliver Food Foundation. And I became more and more aware of the global issues that were linked to agri-food. The fact that we had been developing worldwide a big system that had been developed to produce at very large scale, in a very, in a very systemic way, cheap calories, but not cheap nutrients. And that was the big disconnect. And that when I kind of, understood that was a big shock. I thought, wow, everything is linked. We're pushing farmers to do more. We don't want to pay them for quality. We only want to pay them for quantities. So we are pushing them to do more empty calories that we are distributing and marketing to people and telling them, food is cheap, but it's abundant. And at the same time, unfortunately, creating a huge health disaster, which unfolds very slowly. And that's one of the big issues is that when you tell someone, if you continue to eat like that, you're going to be dead in 20 years, they look at you and say, wow, this is bad news. I'll do something in 18 years. And because right now, I don't see the point in getting too excited about it. So that's really my journey was at the time looking at the global issue, on both sides, farmers and consumers, and in between a system that looked very stable, but producing the wrong things with by pushing farmers to the brink for the most part. So that could have been very depressing, except that, I always see the bright side, or I always seek the bright side. I don't always find it. And I started to look with the foundations. We're looking at backing scientists that were working on everything around food. And I was one of the donors. So I could push some of these science developments. And I became interested by the things on both sides of the equation, really at the extreme. One was the development in soil biology and the understanding that the soil is not inert, that it's actually the undersoil is made of a very rich ecosystem of bacteria and nematode and little things that mostly get killed by industrial farming because we do deep tilling, we leave the soil barren during the winter, and then we add a lot of things in it to foster the fast growth of a single crop variety, and we don't want anything else to live. And so we're doing a pretty good job at that by killing everything. And until recently, probably 20 years ago, roughly, we believed that the soil was actually like sand. You would just put NPK and plants would grow, and it didn't matter what was under. It's only really recently, and that's how I got shocked by discovering that in around 2010, 12, that people recently discovered the richness of this undersoil, but because most of the bacteria, most of the life is anaerobic, which means that if you bring it to the oxygen of the air, they die. So when you do a soil sample and you bring it to a lab, by the time it goes to the lab, everything is dead and then you only see what's at the top and you see the minerals, but you don't see the underlife. So it was really interesting to see that was a really discovery, which really changed everything and got people to really think about making the soil alive again. And it's called regenerative agriculture. And it's how people got into that. On the other side of the equation, at the very end of the supply chain, you have people that started to look at the microbiome of people, what's in your gut, and started to explore the complexity and the importance of matching your microbiome to a certain profile that also corresponds to what you eat, and that your diet has a big influence on that microbiome profile. If you eat too much sugar, it's going to fuel the proliferation of things which are not very good for you. If you don't eat enough fiber, if you eat that and so on. So people were just starting to look at that. And what's really fascinating, and I did that a couple of years ago, was to bring two scientists that would never talk to one another. The scientists that work on the microbiome of the soil, the microbiome that, the same the bacteria that are around the roots and the myceli of the plants, and the scientists who are working on the microbiome of the human guts. And they were talking for the first time in an event, a small event that I organized in the Loire Valley a couple of years ago. And yeah, because we were also working on a microbiome with a local winery, we had the two saying, wow, this is strikingly similar. We're talking about the same bacteria and the same different interaction and everything, which really reinforced my idea that there is a connection to nature that is really deep between who we are through our microbiome, through our guts and the soil, and that this entire system, the food system that is producing these empty calories, these products that are hyper refined, have been hyper processed, that has broken this link between the two, and that's not very healthy. So that's how I got really into my idea of starting an investment firm that would look for things that are almost like biomimicry inspired, so things that are going to, how can we augment nature instead of replacing nature, and find technology. So deep tech, it could be AI based, it could be precision farming, everything, but really apply to making nature more efficient at doing the right things for us and for the environment. I mean, we are just a drop in the thing, but we are so many of us. There's so many of us that we need to think about, how do we deal with this number of people?
You mentioned soil erosion versus soil exhaustion, or two separate terms there. Can you just talk about the difference between those two?
Yes, and it's also linked to drought versus desertification. I think there is right now, we are just on the cusp of really accepting the fact that we have a really screwed up system. We talk about, short-term crisis. There is a drought, there is some erosion. So it seems like it's very temporary, that we can continue to do what we do and things are going to be good again, soon, because, we'll have a better season, because we'll have a little bit less, we can put a few things to slow down the erosion. But we have exhausted the soils. We are in a change of climate. Not going to argue whether it's totally man-made or not, but we have a change of climate. And there are three pillars. I'm extending a little bit beyond just your question, but there are three pillars that underpin the current agri-food system in the world. And these three pillars are really that, water is free for the farmers, that oil is not too expensive, probably maximum $60, $65, $70 a barrel, and that the climate is going to stay in a certain band, because if we don't have these three things, then bad things happen. And let me just develop quickly on that. Water, it's obvious. If we start to have to pay for water because water becomes more and more expensive, 70% or more of the water that we use in the world today is used by farmers for irrigation, because the way 70% of the water we use. That means that if we have less and less water because we have a climate that has changed and the patterns have changed, then we're in trouble unless we start doing farming differently. There are ways to do farming that will reduce by 90% the amount of water we need, but we're not there. And we're pretending that next year is going to be better. The other one is the price of oil. It's not that much to fuel the tractors. Tractors they use oil, but what is the issue is really the making of fertilizers. Because we have been exhausting the soils, we need more and more fertilizers, because the soils are pretty much dead.
Right.
And they cannot sustain any crops anymore in most places, or not enough. And so we need more and more fertilizers, more and more potent fertilizers. And those fertilizers require a lot of energy to be produced. We're using the Haber-Bosch, which was a great invention at the time, a way of doing synthetic fertilizers. That is costing a lot more and more money, because we are using more and more oil on that. And by the way, today, the making of synthetic fertilizers creates about 4% of the global gas emissions. 4% by itself, just that. So that's also not sustainable, because if the price of oil goes up, and there's no reason why it wouldn't go up going forward, because we don't have enough energy yet. So we are pushing the system there. And the final one, which is more dangerous is the fact that we have been using less and less varieties in agriculture. So we only use a few rice varieties. We only use a few corn varieties out of the hundreds that did exist before. Sometimes we are down to 2 worldwide for soya or for wheat. And those varieties have been hyper specialized, they are super efficient, but they assume that we are staying at a certain level of frost versus temperature, heat, hygrometry, even wind. Because, if you have too much wind, if you have long week, then it's going to go down. So you want a short week. I mean, there are lots of things that can make your crops much less efficient because of the changing climate. And it is changing. And it's changing quickly. And when it's not changing, when you have big storms, it could be a political storm like what we have in Ukraine today that creates the same type of issue. So we have because everything is now as long supply chains. So we have a big issue with our system. It's much more fragile than what we were thinking about. So the time is, we don't have time. We need to act quickly to change our system to something that through technology, we can rejig the system, make it much more local, much more seasonal, and much more, environmentally and socially friendly, which we can do, but it's going to take a few years. But most of the innovations are happening, it's in the pipe, and you'll have several waves of innovation one after another. But again, the optimist side of me sees the solution coming in the next few years.
Been talking to a lot of people lately, I would say the last 12 months or so, around regenerative farming, cellular meats or cultured meats, cellular agriculture in general. There's a lot of different things going on in the space of trying to reconcile the issue of food globally. And the one issue that seems to be in common with sort of everybody is that we're trying to use technology, which is really producing some really interesting innovations and going where we want to go around food. But the big elephant in the room is that the supply chain is built, for the last century. And in order to really make the change I think we need at scale is that we have to build and create an entirely different supply chain of how food moves around the world, whether it's domestically or globally. Do you see hope in that there is a way to, while having the traditional supply chain still run sort of as normal, parallel to that, build a completely new, innovative sort of 21st century supply chain that, can handle everything we want it to handle. It can provide affordable food with really rich nutrients at affordable prices rather than, cheap food with empty calories, empty nutrition. I guess, is that something that you see is possible and is sort of being done just from a supply chain perspective?
That's a great question. And that's something that a couple of years ago, most of the first generation of entrepreneurs in the new food system were kind of glossing over because they assumed that, things were going to happen by themselves. So the supply chain logistics is one of the biggest issues. The good news, and again, I don't want to sound like, I always look at good news only, but the good news is people don't eat a single type of food. They eat multiple types of food. So, or at least most people do. I remember some people that there was in the documentary, I saw a guy that was eating only McDonald's every day of his life, and he was only eating Big Macs every day, which, of course, makes it fairly monomaniac. But most people don't. Most people are going to be eating, something different every day, even if there's a rotation, and you're going to have 5 or 6 different meats. So the good news is you don't need to fix every single thing at the same time. And when you think about it, think about the electrical cars and the electrification of cars. That was a much more daunting process because energy is energy. And also it's not like you can put something different in your car. You either put oil or you put electricity. But you cannot go and say, tomorrow I'm going to put some fruit juice in my car, or I'm going to put some, I'm going to put a windmill on top of my car or something like that. No, you have to have the energy at different points that you're going to have on the side of the road And so it's either petrol stations, or in the petrol station, you're going to switch and progressively put the energy supply. So that's a really daunting logistics problem. And you had many other logistics problems that you had to solve in the manufacturing of the cars, the batteries and everything. So yet we're getting there. We're getting there. In 10 years, we'll have probably completed the critical mass of this switch. Compared to that, the multiple changes that need to happen in the food system, we need to think about, what is the capacity that is needed for fermentation for all kinds of new food? What is the capacity that we need in terms of silos for different types of grains, and grains that may be much more decentralized than what we have today. So the silos may not be the same tomorrow that they are today. So you have lots of logistics things to think about, but there are multiple. And so even if one takes longer, I think we'll have a lot of progress made on many others. So I'm fairly confident that when you have opportunities to create businesses, like in fermentation, for example, it is clear that if all the new alternative protein that rely on fermentation processes were to go up in scale tomorrow, there would be a huge bottleneck in fermentation capacity, and especially if the big companies start getting into that. But you know what? There are lots of entrepreneurs who are already looking at that, and they are creating capacity ramp up. And you even have people who are looking at it from a financial point of view and looking at, how do you attract investors in the right way to fund this capacity building. We have more than ever, we have we have hundreds of thousands of entrepreneurs in the world who are looking for opportunities. They are all interconnected. They all read the same information online, and they are aware of new opportunities being created. They think laterally, and the probability that someone is going to come up with a good idea rapidly is much higher than it was 20 years ago, or even more so 40 years ago, when we didn't have these brains interconnected in the world. I think none of the issues that you mentioned require a fundamental scientific discovery. They're all about engineering. It's all about initially tinkering with something and scaling it up to a large scale solution.
You mentioned founders and companies and some of these startups. I'd love to talk about some companies that you've invested in that you feel are doing some incredible things. I had Carlo from Monarch Tractor on the other podcast, Disruptors for Good, where I talked to the founders, creating the companies and building. Robert from Etero, which I believe you're invested in both of those. So there's so many different phenomenal ideas and companies being built. But talk about some others within the portfolio that have come across and the team's been excited about it and really, are building the future.
Yeah. So, and Monarch is really a great company because it's tractors. It's also, it will help farmers concentrate on things which are less repetitive, but it's also data. And it's also about collecting data and applying the right amount of water or the right amount of fertilizers when needed, or the right amount of pesticide if you need to do something. So I'll give you two examples. One is a company called Viv in Switzerland, and they basically at the core, they have deciphered the language of plants. So they can listen to the signals which are, if you have electromagnetic signals that run around the different the trunk of the tree, or the stems and even the leaves. So if you put two electrodes at different places of the plants, you're going to listen. There are going to be a lot of things happening, and if you can decide, distinguish the signal from the noise, you'll be able, and they have been able, applying again AI and machine learning, they have been able to recognize the signal that the plant sends to the rest of its body when it's being bitten by a pest. And it's a different signal if it's a caterpillar that's starting chomping on the leaf, or if it's an aphid that is starting to bite on the root. And so it's going to tell the rest of the plant, we are being attacked. And then maybe some signals are going to go through the soil, through the myceli, and say, something's happening. Now, why do we care about that, apart from the science fiction side of things? It's because if you have, this is pretty cool to think that, plants.
Yeah, this is wild.
They say, it's the farmer coming. Let's pretend we're not ripe yet because we don't want to be harvested. I mean, you could imagine lots of things in terms of novels. But the reality is what you want to do is you want to get a head start, what's going on, so that if you are being warned by your plant in somewhere that, hey, we have caterpillars starting to come in the field, can you guys do something about it? That's pretty much what the plant is doing. And if you come with your pesticide on before you can see anything, but because the plants started to shout, then you'll be able to put maybe 1% of the pesticide to get rid of the beginning of the pest, infestation. You'll be able to, if the plant says, I'm really thirsty, I'm starting to be stressed because there's not enough water. Maybe you can bring the water now, not tomorrow, when you start seeing the leaf start to,
right.
To, and not have an impact on the crop density. So all the things that today we have been taking for granted, that you have to wait until you see something to intervene.
Right.
If you can do it much faster, you'd be able to do a much, so that's precision farming. Then you can send the Monarch tractor that's going to come by itself and say, the pests are here, I can see them now, and apply the solution. But it's going to be a small percentage of what you would have had to spray. And so it's much better for nature. It's much better for everything. That's one company that is really exciting. It's part of the solution, but it is quite a breakthrough in the way you can think about your interaction with your field, with the plants, and with nature. Another example, totally different, but really interesting in terms of thinking about biomimicry, is Insect with a Y. It's a company we found in France, so not very far from our headquarters in Brussels. And we were looking for insects a few years back as an idea, and we started by looking at companies who are selling insects as a more like a gimmick. You can eat that for like dried crickets or something. I was not really convinced that would be a huge market. But I met those entrepreneurs, Antoine Hubert and a couple of his co-founders, and they had been studying all kinds of different insects, but they bumped into one with a biomimicry mindset. They said there's one particular insect that it's a beetle which produces a larvae that when you use it for bait when you go fishing and try to get salmons and trouts in rivers, you have a not infinite, but much better yield in you catch the fish, and your neighbors who are not using the same bait are not going to get them. And they said, why is that? And they decided to look at it, and they found that they had this particular larvae was really nourishing, and that it actually provides a metabolic boost, a metabolism boost for the fish that eat them. They become stronger. And so when they are in the river going up and going up to spawn, this is what this is great. And when they are babies, it's even better for them. So they started to look at that, and they started to do some medical trials, and they found that, the thing is actually really amazingly nourishing, and it has some properties that are very unique to it. There are no other insects that provide that. And so they started to look at how can they grow them in large quantities. And by serendipity, or because nature is well intentioned, they actually love to be huddled together, because that's how they fight against birds. They just stay together, so they form a big pack. So to grow them into, and they like to stay in places where there's no sun, no one sees them. So they decide to put them in trays in a vertical farm and feed them with what they eat, which is the leftover from cereals. They actually eat the bran from cereals. They eat the chaff. They eat what is the leftover from breweries and stuff like that. So something that no one wants really, and they transform that into a lot of very juicy meat, which is what they are. These big fat little larvae, and so you can raise them in very large quantities. They are very happy, and the happier they get, the better, the more digestible they are by animals. So there's a self-positive feedback loop there, and they can grow a lot of them. So that's a great replacement for fish feed. Fish feed being what you get, or fish meal rather. Fish meal is what you get when you go and empty the ocean and you get all the small fish, the small anchovies, the small, big, really, really tiny ones, anchovies, sardines, and so on, mackerels. The tiny ones, they float in the ocean, and people go there with huge nets. They catch them, and they put that into some kind of paste, put that into pellets at the end, and that's what you give to salmons. And it's actually high-end food for salmon in pens when you have aquaculture. It's also really used for feeding your cats and the cat food and so on. So, but the paradox is we think aquaculture is great because we are saving the wild salmon by eating the raised salmon. But the raised salmon, in order to be fed with good quality food, we are emptying the ocean from and for other species that are being put in jeopardy. So that particular insect, as that it's a great replacement. It's actually better for the young salmon because it gives them this metabolic boost that I was talking about. But the real additional beauty is not only do we have a super sustainable way of feeding cats and salmons that is CO2 friendly, that is great for biodiversity, but when you raise them, they actually produce a lot of guano. They reject more than they put in terms of weight. So if you have a factory that does 100,000 tons of little critters that end up being 67,000 because it's a very high proportion of protein. So 100,000 tons factory a year, 100,000 tons of larvae, 67,000 tons of pure protein, and more than 100,000 tons of guano. And that guano is a fantastic organic fertilizer that works wonders for people who are growing vegetables or people who are growing wine. So the grapes. And that's, as I mentioned earlier, finding replacements to fertilizers that are produced today with the Haber-Bosch process. We are using a lot of natural gas, actually coming from Russia, and creating a huge amount of CO2 emission. Here, you have the replacement that is totally organic, that has no CO2 emission, and that we have started to manufacture or grow in very large quantities, having them live a very happy life of an insect until the very moment where they get, they go through a jet steam, and they die very peacefully like shrimps, really. And then you put them in centrifuge, you separate the skin from the protein, and you get this extremely sustainable source of fertilizer, protein, and even in their case, they also produce some oil that can be used for all kinds of different things. So that's a fascinating story.
Wow.
And we are very proud of having found them at the very beginning of their journey.
I wanted to get your thoughts, a couple more questions here before we end. One would be on cellular agriculture and cellular meat, or cultured meat as some people call it. This idea that we could, to me, I'm just so excited about it, and maybe I'm too excited about it because maybe there's things I'm missing here, but the idea that we can just take cells from an animal without harming it and essentially recreate meat or recreate fish, other types of seafood, other animals we're not used to eating. We can simply take cells out and create healthy, meat or seafood, again, whatever it may be. To me, this seems like such a transformational shift in what's possible, not only feeding the world, but feeding the world healthy food and at scale where we can create enough food. We don't have to factory farm animals and have that ugly side of it anymore. Am I missing something here? Or this is, to me, this is sort of the future of how we possibly feed the world and how we possibly take our dependence off of the slaughter of animals to feed ourselves. This seems a much more dynamic, efficient, and healthier way to do it.
I think you're missing a lot of things around that, but that's it sounds very very idyllic but there's multiple aspects to it. First of all, the cost and which is linked to what you were talking about earlier in terms of capacity building. If we were to create, and I get to the benefits of it or not, but if we were to scale that industry, you need a huge amount of calories to feed the cells themselves to grow.
Okay.
You need a lot of sugars that you need to grow somewhere, and you need the right level of sugar and everything. So there's a capacity building that people don't talk about, but you don't create it out of thin air. It's really, you need to feed those cells so that they can grow. So that's by itself is a really interesting challenge that, again, the first few companies that got into that, they were very focused for the right reason on creating a few grams or a few kilos. But, when we get to the millions of tons, that's going to be another issue. Now, you may ask yourself two fundamental questions. The first one is, what is healthy in the meat? And it may not be just the muscle. It may be everything around the muscle. The muscle is the pure protein side of things. But when we say, you should eat, when we tell kids or, there's some popular, there's some wisdom of the crowd that people say, you should have that and that, because when you eat some meat, and especially some innards of the animals, you get some of the vitamins and some, like vitamin K, and you get some of the amino acids that are very difficult to find in plants. That's why people say, it's a healthy diet, there's a little bit of everything. It's in large part because you find not in the muscle itself, but in everything around. The polyphenols, for example, the thing that gives the flavor to meat, are not stored in the cells of the muscle, but they are stored in the interstice, the thing which is made of fat that has been capturing the thing which is, gives you both the flavor and the good things for you. The innards of the animals is also what historically has been very nourishing for people, because again, you cannot find that for the most part in plants. So the nutritional value of building just scaffolding of pure protein cells may not be that great, and you may find better proteins coming out of plant-based type of thing. So I don't think it's going to be the only way to do things. And I really hope for everyone that we can get to a point where from a cost, from a cost base, from a, price point, everything, it becomes affordable to do that for a number of applications. But by then, I would like to think that people will start looking at other type of food, and plant-based food that have the same taste as meat can be maybe even more nutritious and, have more fiber and have all kinds of different things which are better. And the last point is, suddenly we have this negation of what life is about. We have in nature, predation is at the basis of what happens on Earth. And you just need to look under the ocean and see what's happening, during the day and especially during the night, to see that it never stops. You have predation all the time. In nature. So pretending that and we need some of the animals to be in the prairie, because that's how you maintain a healthy ecosystem. If you have a prairie in nature, if you go into Africa, your prairie, you have animals who actually are eating the plants, and you have some animals eating the animals who are eating the plants. So today we have stopped having some of the animals which are incompatible with mankind, because it's kind of complicated to have holy rhinos going around, mammoth and things next to your playground of where your kids are playing. Sure. So we stopped having that, and we have cows, and we have domestic cows, and we have goats, and we have a few things. We have way too many of them today, but we don't want to go all the way to say we should not have any of them. Mm-hmm. So I think there's always the good intention. At some point we go all the way to have too many farm animals, way too many of them. But if we have 10% of them left, or 5% of them left, which still be a big number, with people that are raising them, with all the care and everything. What do you do when they get to the end of their lives, And are you going to just let them rot on the field, or are you going to recycle them into something? So I think that's the type of discussions and conversations that people could have, instead of being either the carnivores that say nothing should change, and the vegans who say, we should stop any killing. I even heard people that say we need to take the high ground and try to reform lions and in Africa, so they stop killing these poor zebras. I mean, there are limits to our hubris as a species.
Yeah, there's sort of a natural ecosystem and life cycle that the animal kingdom goes through, right? Like that's just nature in itself. I'd like to end. The last question here is, so many questions I want, but I want to be respectful of your time. So the last one I'll end with here is, you mentioned the foundation before. That seemed to be a really amazing catalyst, right? For everything sort of you're doing now on the investment side, and looking at ways to impact the world and the planet, right? Through investing, which is, to me, so powerful. Kind of talk about the dynamics of nonprofits being a learning mechanism, right? Being able to maybe, take a little bit of risk into, like, scientists to try to develop something new or something like that. And then you have sort of the investment side that you can sort of learn, what the foundation did in its research and its sort of risk taking or just research in general, and then take that into the investing world. I love this idea of kind of nonprofits having that ability to take risk, not in the same way that an investment firm might take a risk, right? There's risk on both sides, but we need, I think, innovative nonprofits, right, to look at problems and be a part of solving it, because we won't get this venture capital in, or this private capital in, if there's not some type of research that is subsidized in some way, right? Investors don't want to subsidize perhaps the necessary research that goes into all this stuff. Like we said, it takes time, energy, and money, and it's going to be, years and years in this life cycle. But how do you look at your time at the nonprofit and the foundation, and is it still doing similar work today?
So, I think you gave most of the answers in your question, but so Jamie decided a couple of years ago to change some of the way his non-for-profit work was going. So the foundation kind of changed, and we closed the programs we had at the time, and it's much more focused on advocacy now, which is very good at. So he has a lot of impact on that. We at Astanor have chosen to continue to work to give some of our profits to non-for-profit companies. And so we already support a couple of non-for-profit, one in India that I've been working with in the past already, that helps small farmers, actually small women farmers, to transition to regenerative agriculture. And they already have trained about 70,000 farmers, and the big goals we gave them is that what would it take to get to 1 million small farms? There are several million small farms they are mostly family farms around villages and so on. That, when you think about the impact that could have, and we're only helping them with some money, some data, some access to technology and so on. And I think this is the type of things that cannot do as a for-profit organization, but with the right amount of money, right, directed in the right place, you can have a huge impact. The other one we are looking at is a company, is a organization called VIF in France, and they do work with local communities, so mostly small towns. They come and they work with the mayor, and they work with the schools, and they work with the the municipal canteens, and they work with the parents association, sports association, and they bring a lot of food education to people about diet, about the issues around what you could develop if you don't pay attention to your diet, the cost it has to the community, and a way to support people in their transitions through what they call social marketing, which is really supporting people with social networks and so on. So it's a very, very efficient way, and you can measure the decrease of obesity rate in the kids population. And as we discussed at the beginning, especially in low-income communities all over Europe, all over the US, you have this skyrocket level, and making bringing it down is super important. Unfortunately, relying on governments for that is not difficult. Good enough. So it requires and it's very difficult to do it for profit. So that's one of the cases where definitely helping people who are helping others is the right way to do it.
Amazing. Well, thank you so much, Eric. I truly appreciate taking the time. I know you're busy. Best of luck to you and the team for the next decade to come. And, can't wait to see all the companies that come out of your network and portfolio. I've already seen a bunch and talked to a bunch. So it's been really just amazing to see what allocating funds correctly can do, right? It's such an important thing to have allocators of capital, put their dollars in the right startups and the right founders. So really appreciate you taking the time, and best of luck going forward.
Thank you very much, Graham.